The autumn breeze whipped around Sarah Mitchell's face as she jogged up the worn granite steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Her heart pounded, but not from the usual rush of an early morning run. The brisk pace she had set through the empty streets now felt like a distant memory. The truth was, she hadn't had time to cool down properly. Her body was still fired up, a mixture of adrenaline and nerves, as she pulled her ponytail tighter, trying to maintain the composed appearance she was so accustomed to. But today was different. The time on her smartwatch read 9:47 a.m. As she caught her breath, Sarah reached for the small crossbody bag resting at her side. Inside, she carried only the essentials: phone, wallet, and a crumpled parking citation that had somehow landed her here. The ticket had been buried in her car's glove compartment for weeks, tucked away under drafts for upcoming proposals and quarterly reports. It had almost slipped her mind entirely until Jenny, her assistant, had given her that early morning reminder. Today was the deadline. Her mind buzzed with the chaos of her life. For the past 15 years, she climbed the corporate ladder at Global Tech Solutions, her business acumen earning her a reputation that stretched far beyond her company's walls. But here she was, standing at the entrance of a courthouse, dressed in running gear, with a parking ticket in hand. She half wondered if this was some twisted joke. Was this a reminder from the universe that even high-powered executives weren't exempt from life's little inconveniences? As Sarah stepped into the lobby, the hum of activity hit her like a wave. Security guards were stationed at every corner, ushering people through metal detectors while lawyers in sharp suits hustled past, briefcases in hand. She joined the line behind an elderly man, his trembling hands struggling to remove his belt as he prepared for the scanner. "Ma'am, please place your bag on the conveyor," the security guard said, his voice heavy with exhaustion from repeating the same instructions day after day. Sarah complied, removing her shoes and placing them carefully on the conveyor. As she waited, she checked her phone again. 3 missed calls from the Tokyo office. A new email popped up from the board of directors. The afternoon meeting had been moved up to 2 p.m. She had barely time to breathe. The security checkpoint passed without incident, and Sarah moved through the marble halls, consulting the building directory. Courtroom 304. Traffic violations. 3rd floor. She pressed the elevator button, but a handwritten sign on the door announced that it was out of order. Of course, she thought with a wry smile. Another cardio session was exactly what she needed in her current attire. As she made her way up the stairs, Sarah passed a young mother struggling with a stroller, her eyes wide in a mixture of exhaustion and desperation. Sarah's instinct kicked in. "Here, let me help you with that," Sarah said, lifting the front end of the stroller to assist the woman. Her offer was met with a grateful smile, the kind that made Sarah feel like she had done something meaningful, if only for a moment. It wasn't lost on her that this was the very reason she had started her mentoring program for single mothers years ago, a program that had empowered women like this young mother to believe in their own potential, even in the face of impossible odds. Reaching the 3rd floor, Sarah found herself surrounded by a mix of people, some in business attire, others in uniforms, a few in faded clothes that had clearly seen better days. All of them, like her, were waiting for their moment to stand before Judge Henderson, a man known for being stern but fair. Sarah found a spot on a bench near courtroom 304 and pulled out the parking citation to review it one more time. The ticket was for an honest mistake. She'd parked in a loading zone while attending a charity event she had organized downtown. It wasn't the first time she'd made such an oversight, but normally her assistant handled these things. Jenny, however, was on maternal leave, leaving Sarah to face this minor inconvenience on her own. A loud voice echoed from the courtroom doors announcing, "Sarah Mitchell." The clerk scanned the hallway, his eyes landing on her. She stood up, smoothing down her running shorts and adjusting her jacket. She was used to commanding boardrooms, leading international conferences, making multi-million-dollar decisions. But here, in this courthouse, she was just another defendant, dressed in workout gear and facing a simple legal procedure. Or so she thought. As she approached the doors, her phone buzzed again. 4 missed calls from Tokyo. She silenced it, pushing her growing anxiety to the back of her mind. She could handle this. She had to. The heavy wooden doors creaked as Sarah stepped into the courtroom. The the smell of old wood and stale paper hanging in the air. The room was smaller than she had imagined, with wooden benches leading up to the judge's elevated platform. An American flag hung behind the bench, casting a long shadow as sunlight filtered through tall windows. The other defendants, some looking nervous, others resigned, stood in line, waiting their turn. Sarah stood tall, her posture betraying her years of corporate training, but she could feel her nerves rising. This wasn't a room where confidence alone could win the day. The clerk called for the room to rise as Judge Robert Henderson made his entrance. His reputation preceded him. Strict, no-nonsense, but fair. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. As he sat behind the bench, his eyes swept over the room, briefly landing on Sarah before moving on. She could almost hear his internal assessment. Corporate exec. Parking ticket. Should be in and out. But the reality was far more complicated. As Sarah's name was called, Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the case file, flipping through the pages. His hand hovered for a moment before settling on a key piece of information, a small detail that would change everything. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of curiosity. "It says here that you were at a charity event. Tell me, did you receive any sort of benefit from this event?" Sarah blinked. That wasn't the kind of question she expected. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "I was there to support a cause. Nothing more." The judge's gaze sharpened. "And yet, you parked illegally in a loading zone, a spot reserved for those delivering goods and services. You've run a successful business for years. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, do you believe that rules like these should apply to everyone?" The room went quiet. Sarah felt her throat tighten. There was a pause, just long enough for doubt to settle in. Why was this simple parking violation turning into something more? But then it happened, a twist she never saw coming. Judge Henderson leaned forward, the silence heavy between them. "I know you, Miss Mitchell. I know your company. You've made millions, perhaps billions, off the backs of people just like the ones in this courtroom. People who've had to fight for every inch. And now, you're here, complaining about a parking ticket." Sarah's mind raced. She hadn't expected this. A simple court case was turning into a personal attack. Before she could speak, Judge Henderson slammed the gavel down. "The court will review this matter further. You'll receive notice of your next hearing." Sarah felt her stomach lurch. As she turned to leave the courtroom, her eyes met those of the other defendants. They were watching her closely now, not with sympathy, but with something else, judgment. Unbeknownst to her, this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. A battle that would not only challenge her understanding of the law, but spark a public conversation about privilege, bias, and the true meaning of justice. The fluorescent lights above hummed ominously, casting an almost clinical glow over the courtroom as Sarah Mitchell approached the podium. Her athletic wear, tucked neatly into sleek running shorts, paired with a clean, fitted jacket, was far from the expected attire for a formal legal setting. The judge's initial glance barely lasted a second, but in that fleeting moment, his mind was already at work, constructing a narrative. "Another privileged professional who thinks she's above the law," he thought with a tightening of his lips. He glanced at her, his mental judgment already well-formed. Sarah stood before Judge Henderson's elevated bench, feeling the weight of his gaze land on her. Case number 2347. The court clerk's voice echoed through the chamber. Parking violation in a commercial loading zone. Judge Henderson's fingers drummed impatiently against his desk, his gaze skimming over the citation with barely concealed disdain. 3 years on the bench had taught him to size up defendants quickly. He was an expert at discerning those who took the court seriously and those who didn't. Sarah, in his mind, fit perfectly into the latter category. She was dressed in workout clothes, a clear sign of disrespect in his eyes. The morning sunlight streamed through the Venetian blinds, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor, creating the illusion of prison bars. Other defendants sat quietly in the gallery, their eyes flickering with dull interest as they waited for their turn. A young law clerk scribbled notes, glancing occasionally at Sarah, her pencil moving in careful strokes. The bailiff stood stoic by the judge's side, as always, his eyes locked on the proceedings. "Miss Mitchell," Judge Henderson began, removing his glasses with a deliberate motion, his voice carrying the weight of years spent administering justice with a sense of moral authority. He fixed his gaze on her, the notorious disappointment stare that had made many a defendant shrink under its intensity. "Do you make it a habit of treating court appearances as casually as your morning jog?" His voice, smooth and clipped, was heavy with judicial disapproval. Sarah opened her mouth to explain, but before she could speak, the judge raised his hand, halting her words. His gold class ring, a gift from Harvard Law, caught the light as it gleamed in the bright morning sun. It was a symbol of his hard-earned ascent from humble beginnings to the prestigious heights of the federal judiciary. In his mind, the law was sacred, and the court was a place to be respected, not a place for casual attire or irreverence. Respect for the court is non-negotiable. He had fought for years to earn his position, and he expected everyone else to respect it too. The court reporter's fingers moved rapidly across the keys of her stenograph, the sharp staccato clicks punctuating the rising tension in the room. Judge Henderson leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as they focused on Sarah's expensive running shoes and high-end athletic wear. To him, these were not signs of success. They were signs of misplaced priorities. In his world, success was measured by proper decorum and reverence for the law. "The court's time is valuable, Miss Mitchell," he continued, his voice growing more stern. "This isn't a gym or a park. Perhaps if you spent less time at the gym and more time paying attention to parking signs, we wouldn't need to have this conversation." The comment was pointed, unnecessary even, but Judge Henderson was already deep in his ritual of condemnation. He had seen thousands of defendants like Sarah, people who he believed had lost their sense of civility, their respect for the formalities of life. A few soft snickers emerged from the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern look. Judge Henderson shuffled through more papers with deliberate slowness, each motion calculated, a subtle reminder of his control over the situation. His mind had already filed Sarah away as another example of what he saw as a disturbing trend, a society losing its standards, its sense of respect. The American flag behind him swayed gently in the air-conditioning breeze, and as it did, the room seemed to grow smaller. He focused on the details of the citation. The violation had occurred in front of the city's most prestigious office building. But he didn't see the significance of that. He couldn't. In his eyes, it was just another rich person treating the rules like an afterthought. Instead, he honed in on the time of the violation. Middle of the business day. "I see here you parked in a loading zone for nearly 2 hours," he said, his voice growing more pointed with each word. "Perhaps if you spent more time paying attention to parking regulations and less time worrying about your fitness routine, we wouldn't have to be here today." The words were biting, unnecessary, but they stung, and Sarah knew it. Despite the discomfort, she stood perfectly still at the podium, her back straight and posture professional. She had been in boardrooms, dealing with million-dollar deals, but today she wasn't in control. Not here, not now. What Judge Henderson didn't notice, however, was how the energy in the room had begun to shift. Others in the gallery had started to notice something different about Sarah, an unmistakable air of confidence, something that seemed at odds with the casual appearance he had judged her on. It was a quiet kind of power, a strength that wasn't rooted in attire or outward appearance. Sarah's stance, her poise, suggested a level of professionalism that transcended the judgment being placed on her. The courtroom held its breath as the clock on the wall ticked loudly, a steady reminder of the passing moments. Judge Henderson, still fixated on his paperwork, seemed to relish the tension, his eyes darting back and forth across the citation. He didn't see her confidence. He saw only what he wanted to see, a privileged woman, above the law, acting out of turn. Before he could proceed with the fine, Sarah's calm, yet measured voice interrupted him. "Your Honor," she said, the words slipping out almost effortlessly, "I'm not here to argue with you about the fine. I accept that I made a mistake." Her words stopped the judge short. He had been prepared for defiance, for excuses, but not for this calm acceptance. Who was this woman? "I made the mistake of parking in a loading zone. I wasn't paying attention, and I own that mistake," she continued, her voice clear and unwavering. "But there's something you should know. I wasn't at that event to make a profit. I wasn't there to network or further my career. I was there for a cause, something bigger than all of this. She paused, her gaze unwavering. I'm not trying to excuse my actions, but maybe, just maybe, there's a bigger picture here. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at each other. The tone had changed, and they could all feel it. Judge Henderson's eyes narrowed, his lips pressed tightly together. No one had ever spoken to him like this before, not in his courtroom, not like an equal. He slammed his gavel down, the sound like a thunderclap. The fine stands, but your explanation has been noted, Miss Mitchell. The room fell silent, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. Sarah turned and walked back toward the gallery, her mind racing. What had just happened? Had she just been put in her place? Or had she, in fact, just shifted the balance of power? As she took her seat, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. The small shift in the energy of the courtroom was palpable. The moment was far from over. Leaning forward in his high-backed leather chair, Judge Henderson's voice dropped low, cold, and accusatory. Do you think your time is more valuable than everyone else's in this courtroom? He gestured broadly at the other defendants, working-class people, their attire a stark contrast to Sarah's gym clothes. His gold ring caught the light as he made the sweeping motion. Do you think you can simply walk in here dressed for a morning run and expect special treatment? Sarah remained perfectly still at the podium, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her posture was impeccable, professional even. Yet the judge saw only defiance in her calm demeanor. She thinks she's above it all, he thought, irritation building. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, a stark contrast to the heated exchange unfolding before the court. Your Honor, I can explain, Sarah began, her voice steady, clear, and unshaken. I'm not finished, Judge Henderson interrupted sharply, his voice rising slightly as he cut her off mid-sentence. The court reporter's fingers flew across the stenograph, capturing every word of the increasingly tense exchange. The atmosphere had shifted, thick with expectation. In my 23 years on this bench, Judge Henderson continued, his voice growing more rigid, I've seen a growing disrespect for our judicial system. People treating this courtroom like it's a coffee shop or a gym. His eyes never left her as he picked up the citation again, glaring at the details. 2 hours in a loading zone, he read aloud, his tone dripping with disdain. And now, you appear before this court dressed like you're heading to a yoga class. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but it was quickly silenced by the bailiff's sharp glare. Yet the tension in the room had become almost palpable. I'm doubling the fine to $300, Judge Henderson announced with finality, his voice sharp with authority. Perhaps that will serve as a reminder that this court demands respect. The young law clerk behind the judge had stopped sorting through the files entirely. His attention was fixed entirely on Sarah, his eyes widening at the judge's increasingly hostile stance. Sarah's face remained neutral, her expression calm, but something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not frustration, but something else. A quiet resolve. She wasn't intimidated. The judge warmed to his theme, his words now fully laced with condescension. Furthermore, I'm adding a mandatory court fee of $150 for your inappropriate attire. This is a court of law, Miss Mitchell, not a fitness center. His voice carried that special edge of superiority he reserved for those who, in his view, needed a lesson in respect. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't flinch when he delivered the blow of the increased fine. She didn't flinch when he attacked her attire. Her posture remained unchanged, but there was an energy building within her that the judge failed to notice. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. The angle of the light seemed almost theatrical now, as if fate itself were setting the stage for what was about to unfold. Sarah's voice broke the silence once again. Your Honor, she began, her tone still calm, still professional, yet now filled with an undeniable authority. But Judge Henderson wasn't finished with his lecture. In my experience, Miss Mitchell, people who can't be bothered to dress appropriately for court often display the same casual attitude toward their civic responsibilities, he continued, his voice turning almost sanctimonious. He adjusted his reading glasses, peering over them at her, as if she were a student he had caught failing an exam. "The loading zone you parked in serves businesses that depend on that space for their livelihood," he lectured, his words more pointed now. "Your convenience doesn't trump their needs." The irony of his statement hung in the air, but he was too wrapped up in his self-righteous narrative to notice. He never even bothered to ask why she was there, Sarah thought, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. But she kept her face neutral, her eyes trained on the judge, her voice unwavering as she responded. "That loading zone, Your Honor," Sarah began again, but this time there was a change. The calm in her voice didn't waver, but it was clear now she was taking control. The judge, still basking in his sense of authority, didn't hear the change. He continued, unrelenting. "That brings your total to $450, Miss Mitchell," he announced almost gleefully. "Perhaps next time you'll think twice about both your parking choices and your courtroom attire." He reached for his gavel, ready to bring the hammer down, sealing the judgment. But something in Sarah's posture caught his attention. For the first time that morning, his certainty wavered. There was an air about her, something quiet and composed, but undeniably powerful. It wasn't defiance, not arrogance, but an unspoken confidence that stood in stark contrast to everything he had assumed about her. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the ensuing silence. The judge's eyes flicked toward her, preparing to dismiss the case and move on to the next defendant. But instead, he asked, almost as an afterthought, "Do you have anything to say before we conclude this matter, Miss Mitchell?" It was a question he had asked hundreds of times before, but never with genuine curiosity. He didn't expect her to answer, certainly not in any way that would challenge his carefully constructed narrative. But this time he was about to be proven wrong. Sarah Mitchell reached calmly into her crossbody bag, her movements slow but deliberate. The courtroom remained silent, the air thick with tension as everyone watched her. She pulled out a sleek leather wallet, the kind one might expect from a successful executive, smooth and pristine. "Your Honor," she began, her voice as steady as ever, carrying the same authority she used in board meetings. "I'll be happy to pay the fine with my corporate card." Judge Henderson's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. But Sarah wasn't done yet. "However," she continued, "before I do, I should mention that I'm the Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Tech Solutions International." The words hit the room like a punch. A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. The young law clerk behind the judge nearly dropped his stack of files, and the court reporter's fingers paused mid-sentence, hovering over the stenograph as everyone in the room absorbed her words. The judge's expression flickered. For the first time, his certainty wavered. He looked down at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Sarah placed a business card on the podium, its gold embossing catching the morning light. "The loading zone in question," she continued, her voice calm but now laced with quiet power, "is actually in front of our corporate headquarters." The room seemed to hold its breath. What was happening? Sarah pressed on, unflinching, her words calm but cutting. "I was there that morning overseeing a community outreach program we sponsor. We were loading supplies for our annual youth coding camp, which provides free technology education to underprivileged children." A hush fell over the room. No one had expected this, least of all Judge Henderson. But Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out another document, a permit for the event that had been accidentally filed a day late. She placed it next to her business card, pushing it gently toward the judge. "This permit," Sarah explained, "was filed late. That was the mistake, not the violation itself. We were running behind schedule, but we had every legal right to be there." For the first time that morning, Judge Henderson's expression faltered. The narrative he had constructed, the assumptions he had made, were all crumbling around him. This wasn't just another entitled defendant. She was something else entirely, had fallen into an almost surreal silence. The weight of the moment hung in the air, so thick that it seemed to stifle even the flow of time. Judge Henderson, usually resolute in his judgments, now found himself caught in an internal battle, one that had nothing to do with law, but with something deeper. His hands hovered over the gavel, unsure of the next step to take. The moment felt suspended, as if the entire courthouse had collectively exhaled, waiting for him to respond. He looked at Sarah Mitchell again, but this time his gaze was different, less judgmental, less dismissive. For the first time, he truly saw her. Not as the woman in running clothes, not as a figure who had dared to question his authority, but as a person. A person whose integrity and commitment to her community and company spoke louder than the clothes she wore. The BFF, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, glanced at the judge, and then at Sarah, his expression unreadable. The gallery was still, but there was a quiet undercurrent of respect, a palpable sense of anticipation for the resolution of this confrontation. Judge Henderson cleared his throat once more, this time with a deep sigh. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice quieter, more thoughtful. I believe I owe you an apology." His words, though simple, were like a sudden release of pressure, as if the years of ingrained biases that had shaped his judicial approach were cracking open. Sarah nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without gloating. There was no smugness in her expression, no sense of victory. Instead, she held herself with the same dignity that had guided her through the previous minutes, understanding that this moment was not about personal triumph, but about a larger conversation, one that had now, finally, been started. Judge Henderson set down the gavel. The room held its breath. "I will rescind the additional fines and court fees," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I will reduce the original fine to $50 as is standard for a first-time offense." The words were straightforward, but the underlying message was profound. He had learned something today, something that, if embraced, could change the way he saw his role as a judge. He paused, looking at Sarah Mitchell once more, his expression now free of judgment, his voice stripped of condescension. "I also want to thank you for the reminder," he added, his tone softening. "For the reminder that respect is earned through actions, not appearances." A murmur rippled through the gallery, and even the court reporter's fingers stopped for a moment, the hum of her stenograph now a muted echo in the background. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted once more, this time into something that felt like a shared moment of awakening. The silence that followed his words was full of meaning, a collective understanding hanging in the air. Sarah didn't respond immediately, but her expression softened. She reached into her bag, pulling out her corporate card once more. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply, her voice steady and composed. The courtroom was still. Every eye in the room was focused on Sarah as she placed her card on the podium, ready to pay the fine. No longer the issue at hand, but rather a footnote in a much larger conversation. The judge nodded slowly, his earlier defensiveness replaced by something else, perhaps humility, or perhaps a genuine attempt to learn from his mistakes. "Court is adjourned," he said, his voice carrying a new weight, one that felt both earned and transformative. As Sarah turned to leave, she caught the eyes of the other defendants in the gallery. Some of them smiled at her. Others gave subtle nods of acknowledgement. The BFF, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. Even the court clerk, who had earlier looked at her with disbelief, now gazed at her with quiet admiration. Outside the courtroom, Sarah's phone buzzed again. Tokyo was waiting for her, but for once, she didn't feel rushed. The moment had shifted something inside her, something that had nothing to do with deadlines or board meetings, but with a deeper understanding of the world she was part of. She had shown the courtroom something more than her professional accomplishments or her community work. She had shown them what it meant to be truly seen beyond surface-level assumptions. As she walked out of the courthouse, the autumn breeze caught her hair once more, but this time it felt different. More than just a fleeting gust, it seemed like a reminder of the new chapter unfolding, a reminder that sometimes the smallest moments can change the course of a life. And as for Judge Henderson, his gaze lingered on the papers before him, but his mind was far away, already processing the lesson that had been taught to him in the most unexpected way. He had learned that justice was not just about the law. It was about people, about understanding them in all their complexity, in all their forms. And as he looked at the other defendants in the gallery, he knew that his approach to judgment would never be the same again. In the end, it wasn't Sarah Mitchell's running shoes or her attire that had changed the courtroom. It was her ability to challenge assumptions, to stand firm in the face of bias, and to remind everyone in that room, himself included, that the most important thing we wear is our character. And with that, the case was closed. But the lessons learned would echo through that courtroom for much longer than any fine could have. As Sarah took Judge Henderson's hand, she felt a quiet sense of gratitude for the man before her. Not because of his apology or his change of heart, but because in this moment, he had done something rare. He had embraced vulnerability and chosen to grow. He wasn't just a judge anymore, delivering his verdicts from an elevated, distant position. He was a person, standing on equal ground, acknowledging that his understanding of justice had been incomplete, and that the true essence of fairness lay in recognizing and challenging one's own biases. The applause that filled the courtroom felt like a wave, sweeping over the room with a sense of collective relief, almost as if everyone present was witnessing the birth of something new, not just a change in the judge's perspective, but a shift in the system itself. In that moment, the walls of the courtroom seemed to recede, and the space transformed into something more human, more open, a place where understanding, empathy, and genuine reflection could coexist with the pursuit of justice. The young law clerk, still processing the scene before him, slowly closed his notebook and placed it on the desk. He looked around at the gallery, at the defendants who were watching this unfolding moment with a mixture of awe and hope. For the first time in his career, he realized that the work he did in the courthouse wasn't just about interpreting the law. It was about people. All of them. As the applause died down, Sarah's gaze lingered on Judge Henderson, her expression softening. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly. "This is the kind of change our society needs more of, acknowledging where we fall short and working together to make it better." Henderson nodded slowly, his voice still thick with emotion. "And thank you, Miss Mitchell. You've reminded me that fairness isn't about what's on the surface. It's about seeing each person for who they truly are." He took a deep breath, stepping back toward his bench, but this time he did so not with the authority of the past, but with a newfound humility. He had just set in motion a change that would ripple out beyond his courtroom, something that would touch not just the defendants who came before him, but also the lives of the lawyers, clerks, and all those who would follow his example. "Let the record show," Judge Henderson continued, his voice steady now, "that today, this court adopts a new policy, not only for bias recognition training, but also for fostering an environment where all people are treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, their status, or their background." His words were more than just procedural. They were a statement, a commitment to doing better, to seeing more, to listening harder. As he returned to his seat, he turned once more to Sarah, who was still standing calmly at the podium. "I will make sure this change is felt in every corner of this courthouse," he said, a quiet resolve in his voice. "And I hope that, in time, we can be the example for other courts, for other institutions, and for others who may still carry those hidden biases." Sarah nodded in acknowledgement, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. The clerk was already on the phone, calling for the immediate implementation of the new bias recognition training program. The young intern, her hands still trembling from the intensity of what she had witnessed, began typing with purpose, making sure to capture every word of this historic moment. Outside, the city carried on with its usual hustle and bustle, oblivious to the transformation that had just occurred inside courtroom 304. But inside, the seeds of change had been planted, and those who had witnessed it would carry the memory with them, knowing that justice, in its truest form, was not about uniformity, but about understanding the rich, complex, and multifaceted nature of every person who came before the law. The clock ticked again, marking the passage of time, but in that courtroom, it felt as though the hands of the clock had slowed. The tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud had dissipated, leaving behind a quiet sense of resolution. As Sarah made her way to the door, she couldn't help but feel that in some small way, she had made a difference today, not just in this courtroom, but in the system itself. She glanced back at Judge Henderson one last time, catching his eye. The transformation was not yet complete, but it had begun, and sometimes that's all it takes to start. As the door closed behind her, the sound of the courtroom door clicking shut felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. And the sun, now fully risen, streamed in through the windows, casting everything in golden light. The shadows had disappeared,